Welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you, as always, for joining me for another edition of the show. This week, I wanted to talk a little bit about the expansion or potential expansion of the NCAA basketball tournament for both the men's and women's game. And this is a topic of conversation that has been in the works now, I want to say, for a couple of years, and a decision was recently made to table this discussion until about 2027, right? And while they're doing that, there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of discussion about changing the format, right? And so before we kind of get into that, let's kind of go through a brief history of the format changes that have happened in the NCAA tournament. So it starts in 1951 and it goes from 8 teams to 16. Then 2 years later in 53, it goes to 22 teams. Stays there for about 22 years. Then in 1975, we go to 32 teams. In 79, 4 years later, we're up to 40. Then the next year in 80, we're go to 48. In 83, we're at 52. And in 85 is the accepted 64 team format that most people recognize today. And that was the case for a really long time until 2001 when they added the play-in team. So now it's 65. And then in 2011, it expanded again to increase to the first four, which is basically the play-in games right before the tournament of 64 starts. And that was in 2011. Now, the proposals that we've seen so far are to add to 72 or 76 teams, which kind of creates even more playing complexity for this tournament. And I think that we're in danger here of a product that could be diluted. And the reason I say that is because the NCAA tournament, I think it's encapsulates a sports story that we absolutely love. It's the Cinderella. It's where legends are made, and a lot of times players develop their brands to take into the NBA or WNBA, right? And all that happens in the 64, right? And the magic of March Madness is the bracket, right? And that's what keeps so many people locked in, tuned in, and coming back for more. To the point, you could argue that the tournament now has kind of superseded any semblance of importance that the regular season might have had. You may say that's a good thing, you may say that's a bad thing. It really depends on where you land on college basketball. But for a lot of people, they don't tune in until at the very least conference tournament time in February leading into March. So the NCAA and college sports and these conferences as a whole are saying, well, if all they're watching is the tournament, let's just jump in to make the tournament even larger. So by adding another potentially 8 teams or so, you're giving a lot of those teams that are on the bubble, right? So the your first four out type teams in the bracketology, you're giving those teams an opportunity to play for in front of a big arena to gain revenue from that. And they're just saying, well, they love March Madness. Let's give them more March Madness, right? But at what point is this just diluting a good product? Because the thing is, it's like right now when you do a bracket, you're kind of picking these playing games, and a lot of people don't really care about that. They care about once you get to the 64. And so if that's the case, when you're adding more to this playing complexity where it's almost like its own little, weird tournament to get to the real tournament, it almost is treated like a postseason preseason as convoluted as that sounds, right? And I think at 64, and you can make an argument for when it was 32 as well, but there's a symmetry that comes with this tournament. It's that it's very neatly organized, right? In multiples of 16, because then you have the 1 through 16 rankings and seedings and all that. When you start adding buys, you start adding play-ins, start adding all this stuff, it just becomes a little bit more confusing. And think about for the person who is consistently in the office pool or is playing a bracket challenge on ESPN or something like that, 64 is easy to understand. 68, you could kinda get there because there's only a couple games, right? But when you start adding more and more and more, then it becomes like, "Well, why am I even bothering with this?" Right? Or, "Can I just get in on this tournament when we figure out who the 64 teams are?" And it almost feels like we're creating this to be able to just have more eyeballs on it and hoping that it catches fire because and it's going to devalue the importance of conference championship games even more than they've already been devalued. The regular season is already that's out with the bathwater, right? That's just kind of, a formality to see who gets to 19, 20 wins first, to be able to be considered as an at-large team here. And I was reading an article in Sports Illustrated on Sports Illustrated website about this recently, and it's basically like, the small schools aren't going to be the teams that get in here. It's your lower rung Big 12, ACC, SEC, Big 10, Big East team that'll get an Atlantic 10 team or one of these, prominent mid-major conference teams kind of get into the mix. And I think a big problem that we're having right now is that college sports as a whole is continuing to gravitate towards quantity. Like they say, okay, people like this. Let's just continue to give them more of this so they keep on tuning in. We see in college football already, they had the 14 playoff for a little while, then they went to 12 teams. And right now, immediately, they're talking about going up to 16. And in college football, there's the argument that you're letting unworthy teams in. In college basketball, the unworthy teams are kind of the whole deal, right? But if you're just bringing in a loaded power conference team that really underwhelmed, like last year, for example, Rutgers, who was in the Big Ten, maybe they sneak in with their two lottery picks, right? And Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey. And then you get to see those guys who are going to be in the NBA in March Madness. Is that the draw? Because those are the type of teams you're gonna get. You're not gonna get another team from the Northeast Conference or something, right? You're gonna get that 5th, 6th, 7th place team from the Big 12 or the ACC. And you just start to kinda wonder, is like, "Well, is that what we really want? Do we want, like, a middle of the road team that it's almost like in pro sports in the NBA, a lot of people say that the NBA playoffs has too many teams, right? Because a lot of these mediocre teams are in the play-in and all that, and everyone has a chance. And then a lot of people are like, "Well, what do I want to see a Miami Heat team that finished below 500 in the playoffs, right? Why do I want to see a 4-game series with the number one seed for that team, right?" And in college, it's like they get so many teams complain. It's like, "Oh, I can't believe we didn't make it in this year. We should have been in. We had a resume, blah, blah, blah." And you have all these debates, right? And then it's like, they're just like, "All right, fine, here, have have this at large bid, and now we're at 76." And it just feels like they see the product that gets the ratings. In basketball's case, it's March Madness tournament. In football's case, it's the playoff. And so when that's the case, you're just gonna kinda double, triple, quadruple down on that. It's like, "Well, they like the playoff, let's give them more playoff. They like March Madness, let's give them more March Madness." And I think we're entering a point where is the quality just not good anymore? And if you're just letting everyone in, are you really kind of rewarding these good teams? And it seems to me that it's a bit of a incorrect way to go about the process of selecting teams and crowning a champion because getting conference champions in there I think makes sense because you're rewarded for winning your conference. And if we just start to bring in more and more and more of these power teams just so they could get the revenue of an NCAA tournament game, then I feel like you're sending the wrong message. And that leads me to the next thing here, which is media rights now have determined so much of what an entity is going to do, right? So when the media rights deals for the SEC, the ACC, the Big 10, the Big 12 are so large, those teams and those schools and the people that make the decisions there, the power brokers, they want to be as exposed as they possibly can for more eyeballs, more revenue, more ad slots, more dollars, right? More payouts to the school. And it seems like the decision making now is really based more on how can we keep those people happy than, hey, let's have a compelling product. And you can make the argument that a second place team in the Atlantic 12 is, or Atlantic 10, excuse me, is probably more interesting than the eighth place team in the Big 12 or the ACC, right? In terms of what you see on the court. And I think it kind of diminishes what made the tournament great in the first place. Because think about when Florida Gulf Coast went on their run to the Elite Eight. No one heard of this school, and they were flying around, throwing alley oops, doing all this stuff. It's the power of the unknown is what's so great in college basketball, right? Historically, is that you get these teams, and no one heard of Valparaiso before, and then Bryce Drew comes, starts hitting some shots, and all of a sudden they captivate a nation. You don't get that same excitement if a Georgetown team that was like 500 sneaks in, right? It's just like, yeah, this is a team I watched on ESPN, and they're okay, but they're not great, right? That kind of thing. There is no magic in the bottle, and it kind of harkens back. I wrote about this shortly after the tournament ended last year when it was so chalky, right? That Cinderella teams are becoming extinct. And when you're expanding, you're just adding more Power Five conferences and those teams from those conferences in, and it gives even less breathing room for, a mid-major or quote unquote Cinderella team. And it almost feels like we're in this moment where college sports is becoming more and more professionalized. And I've talked about this with guests on the show before. It's becoming more professionalized. It's obviously there's an NIL aspect and there's the de facto free agency with transfer portal. But beyond that, all the resources go to these big conferences. I truly feel we are in a point where there's a fault line here and we're seeing the separation happen. And eventually what this is going to result in is a couple of these conferences forming a semi-pro league, right? Using the names and logos and likenesses of the teams that they represent, right? At this point, Duke basketball is a professional operation, and Michigan State basketball is a professional operation at this point. To act like it's on the same playing field as in a Bowling Green or something like that is foolish, right? And that's the great divide right now is that these media rights and the conferences that are really paying up all that money are the ones that matter the most. And it leads us to believe here, when is it all going to be enough? Are we going to end up in some sort of 128 team tournament down the road? Are we going to be so tuned in for that? Because at some point, there's too much, right? Like the NFL, for example, has kind of tinkered with its playoff formula, but by and large, it's kept it finite enough where it's not too much football, but it is a decent amount. And I think that's where they've succeeded. The NBA, I think, has fallen into the trap. There's no reason that the first round should be 7-game series, especially like think about Oklahoma City versus Memphis, Cleveland versus Miami this past playoff. It's too much, right? Why am I tuning into that? And you wonder why the ratings are down. There's no sense of importance, right? And when it comes to March Madness, that first weekend is everything to so many people. You really think about it. Everybody's talking about their bracket and how they picked this Cinderella, this 12 seed to beat this 5 seed, this 13 seed to beat this 4 seed, whatever. After that first weekend, once you get closer to the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8, people are still watching, but it's not this ravenous call in from work, cultural, national moment that you get with the opening weekend. And that's because we love to see the upsets. It's like a full slate and it's become a cultural national tradition. You start increasing that, you lose some of that. right? Like, it's like, well, I got to pay attention the week before because I got to deal with the first, 12 to 14 teams that have to be eliminated first before I get to that actual 64 that I care about, right? And and I think we're letting so much of this be dictated by the interests of broadcast rights, networks, big conferences. And it's forever to me the dichotomy of sports, right? Which is sports has an artistic quality to it at times. It has a sort of um, beauty to it that kind of transcends capitalism at times, right? But there is the capitalist element to fund it, which is getting it on TV, getting eyeballs, getting streams, that sort of thing. And so often these two entities are in constant combat with one another. You can make the argument that it would be better just to have 32 teams, right? That if in terms of higher quality basketball, that would make sense, right? But that's never going to happen because once you open the door to more, you can't close the door. It's like Pandora's box, right? Once you let the cat out the bag, it's there. It's out. You have to deal with it now. And if they increase it to 76, there's no coming back. It's not going to be a situation where they're like, "Hey, we saw what happened here, and this is a bad idea. Let's not do this anymore." And that's never going to be the case. It's always going to be about, okay, how can we add more and more and more and get more people to watch? And as long as the ratings are there, they're going to continue to do it, even if it's nominal. But the soul of this tournament, I think, is becoming compromised. Where it had just enough of craziness, to intrigue everybody, but when you have this just bucket that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you end up with a tournament that becomes just diluted, and why would I care? Right? Is what the thing becomes. And, like, you start ending up with, a couple 500 teams in the play-in side of it with multiple playing games now and multiple playing rounds to get to the 64 that people actually care about. And you start to wonder, what are we even doing here? And so I'm hoping that they don't expand, but at the same time, it also feels like it's inevitable. Expansion is the name of the game. It's all about what they can get away with in terms of generating more time slots, which is more ad revenue, which is more potential eyeballs, right? And I just, for something that I grew up on, it's a sad development because it's all at the end of the day, it is a money based situation and they're going to do what makes them more money. I just wish that 64 would have been enough. I wish that format would have been enough. And I'm hoping that they don't just continue to expand for the sake of expanding, and then we have a tournament that I mean, the final already stretches past March, right? So the term March Madness is a little fraudulent, right? That and then we have stuff that's bleeding into mid-April, and it's just like, let's put more stuff on for the sake of having more stuff. I wish that there was a balance somewhere between the profitability and the sense of urgency of creating an important moment, as opposed to just a couple of mediocre teams battling out for the right to get blown out by Auburn or something, right? And so I'm hoping that changes, but I'm not optimistic that it will. And it's a sad development because I do think March Madness, the field of 64, is one of the best sports things we do in America. And we're kind of losing it a little bit. Where we're continuing to sacrifice it at the altar of profitability. And I think at some point there has to be a balance between what's profitable and what's the correct decision for the progression and interest in the sport. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap it up here for another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you as always for tuning in. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure to give us a follow on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And YouTube, excuse me. I said Spotify twice. But definitely give us a follow, leave a comment if you are interested in this topic or any topics that we talk about. Until next time, I'm your host, Omar Zaran, Deep Cover Podcast. We'll see you next time.